Fast forward into the 12th century. Ferns becomes a diocesan centre in the reform of the 12th century. Basically what happens is the Irish Church's unusual practices have drawn the attention of the English Church. Gentleman on the left here is Lanfranc, one of the famous archbishops of Canterbury. It's the English Church, the church in Canterbury, that's agitating for the Irish Church to reform itself. It's got odd practices, abbots passing on monasteries to their sons. They're not supposed to have sons, but they are. So there are a lot of abuses that need to be fixed. The English Church is also agitating for reform for its own political purposes as well. In Cashel in the middle, in 1101, there is a synod at which the process of reform begins. And then in 1111, the date I have here, there's a great synod at a place called Rathbrazil, at which it's decided that Ferns is going to be one of the new bishoprics. It has an advantage, Ferns, in that Wexford doesn't have a bishop. It could have had, or the people of Wexford could have got themselves a bishop if they'd wanted to, being Scandinavian, but they hadn't, which left Wexford open for Ferns to take the diocesan seat instead. 1152, there's a Cathedral of Ferns. Where is it? What did it look like? It's underneath us, probably. It's very likely that the original early monastic church wasn't significantly rebuilt to become a cathedral. That happened very little in Ireland before, the 13th century. It was probably altered a little bit, given new windows, or maybe enlarged a little bit. But basically, the Bishop of Ferns, from 1111 all the way through, is praying and running a diocese from within an older building that's simply been dolled up a little bit. Move on to 1162. Now we're in the age of Diarmuid MacMurrough. Excuse me. Here he is on the left-hand side. Diarmuid's a very interesting gentleman, as you know. He's surrounded by a culture of violence. He seems quite thuggish, but he's also a great supporter of the church. To us, that would be slightly hypocritical. That's simply what it was like being in the Middle Ages. He founded Augustinian and Cistercian monasteries. He had a certificate of confraternity from Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the senior Cistercian in the European order. So he's very highly regarded in church circles. And he founds the Abbey that's just across the field there, the Abbey of St. Mary, for Augustinian canons regular. 1183, we've got the first of three bishops I want to talk to you about briefly. Joseph Ojeda, he dies in 1183. And of course, you should instantly note two things here. Number one, he's got an Irish name. And number two, he dies 15 odd years after the invasion. So, although the Anglo Normans invade in 1169, thanks to Diarmuid, and they're here, they're in this area, there's an Irish bishop still here. They don't move him out. In England, they started moving out Anglo-Saxon bishops as early as they could. Here in Ireland, they allowed some stay on, as indeed here. Why so? I think there's probably a very simple explanation for that. The initial years of Anglo Norman activity in Ireland are very much about a kind of state building, granting lands, getting people to swear fealty, getting soldiers in, building castles, promoting towns, etc., etc. The church can wait, basically. The church is fine. They're not too bothered about cathedrals, the Anglo Normans. They take their time before they replace the native bishops. The Anglo Normans are much more interested in founding monasteries, which they start doing from about the 1190s. And the reason is monasteries have better access to money. If you have a monastery, you get the tithes of the parish churches. So if you found monasteries, you can begin to gobble up the money that's in the countryside. So the first thing they do when they're dealing with the churches, they found monasteries. They leave the bishoprics just sort of sit for a little while longer. Alba is embedded in that culture. He's familiar with it. But as a sign of just how embedded he is and how he is favoured by the English, despite the fact that he is a native. Number one, this is Gerald of Wales, Geraldus Cambrensis, the man who witnessed the invasion and wrote about it. Gerald was a churchman. Gerald desired to be Bishop of Ferns and was kept out of the see by a native Irish man. Alba himself actually was really quite dismissive of English bishops. He didn't like them much and openly said so, and yet still held on to the bishopric here. So Gerald of Wales, who was his sworn enemy, they didn't like each other, they clashed. Gerald of Wales lost out on Ferns because this man is here and he's holding on and he's not being moved over. Next one across is Richard I. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, 1189 to 1199, the man who went on all the Crusades. Alba is at his consecration in Westminster Abbey. He's there when this man is crowned king. Again, he's an Irish bishop. Next one along is King John, Lord of Ireland and king of this corner of the world from 1199. John decides Alba would be a great Archbishop of Cashel and tries to maneuver him in. It doesn't happen, but nonetheless, here's an Irish bishop being touted by the king to take the principal archbishopric in the south of Ireland. And then finally, William Marshall, of course, and everyone knows the story. William Marshall appropriated church land. The bishop did his nut, got onto the Pope. The Pope excommunicated him. After his death, there's an attempt to put it all right, and Henry III says to Alba, look, I'll work on the Marshall family to get your land back. You sort of unexcommunicate him, etc., etc. Alba goes along to the grave with the family, and instead of saying, I forgive you, William, you're back in the fold, you're going back to heaven, etc., etc., he just stirs it up and makes it worse. He says, not only are you a bastard, but all your kids and family are as well, and there won't be any male heir, etc., and he just lost the head. In terms of a plan, Alfred Clapham, the great Alfred Clapham, reconstructed a plan like this. Cooper gave us this drawing of the cathedral, so Clapham drew it like this. I studied this quite a lot when I was working with Rhiannon on the paper. I think Clapham got it wrong. I think it's like this. I think it had a very long east end along here, and I think it had transepts, certainly, and it had aisles running along the side of this part of the church, and that you descended here into the crypt and then back out possibly on this side. You need to get into the crypt. You don't get into the crypt from the body of the church. You need to come in from the side. That's why I think it has this. I don't know how long it was. I think it was probably quite long. What I've reconstructed here by combining what I can see and what Austin Cooper drew is a big cathedral. Plain but big, with provision for a complex liturgy, and perhaps at some stage the relic of St. Aidan, or a relic down in the crypt, worthy of veneration. It has been suggested that the effigy was down in the crypt. The effigy wasn't in the crypt. They didn't put effigies in crypts. They're way too dark. Let me put Ferns in chronological context for you, and then explain to you why I think we need to know about this type of Gothic architecture and how thinking about this type of architecture will allow us to understand the world of the 13th century a little bit better. Here's a timeline, 1160 to 1300. There's the invasion roughly there. England, Gothic appears shortly after the Anglo Normans have invaded Ireland, the 1170s, Canterbury and Wells and so on. So the first Anglo Normans who came to Ireland didn't know about Gothic architecture at all. The style carries on in England until about the year 1240, when the English change it. They rebuild Westminster Abbey, and it causes them to create a new type of architecture. Here in Ireland, Gothic comes in the 1190s. It's a little bit late coming in here. That has partly to do with, the lordship bedding down, partly to do with money, partly to do with their own familiarity with what this new style is. So there's a time lag. That's really no big deal. I think St. Thomas's in Dublin, which is now gone, is the very first. I've argued in print a few times that there's very good evidence to suggest it was a Gothic building. That's 1192. Grey Abbey, County Down, Cistercian, 1193. And I think the first sign of it crossing the Shannon might be Cong from about 1203. So look, it's beginning to arrive around the year between 1195 and 1205, that 10-year period. You'll notice that these examples I've given you, I can give you others, are monastic churches. For the reason, as I said to you already, by founding monasteries, they're able to get access to parish tithes and so on. So founding monasteries is of value to them. And in order to run a successful diocese, you need to have these bodies in place. And my sense would be that the Anglo Normans are spending time creating these bodies. Because they're not already here, they need to be set up. So the process of taking over a cathedral involves creating the administrative structure for the cathedral. The administrative structure of the cathedral will then raise the money to help rebuild the cathedral, and that's what causes the delay. And that's why it's in the 1220s or thereabouts that we see Gothic appearing in our cathedrals, such as here. Ferns actually is quite interesting in that when John St. John becomes bishop, there's immediately a capitular body. There's immediately an administration in Ferns. And it's unusual in that regard. And myself and Rhiannon argue in our article in the Billy Colfer book that the previous bishop, Bishop Alba, actually installed that body. He's a Gaelic Irish bishop who gives the cathedral its administrative structure. And the more I think about that, the more I'm inclined to think that Ferns might actually have been started under the Irish bishop, that we don't have to wait until John St. John at all. So that's where Ferns fits.